So as you were making the Notes app or following along to the Notes app video, you probably thought that the way we were doing things with shared preferences worked a bit, but it was a bit of a fiddle. To get all of our data into there and then to update it regularly was a bit of a hassle. And that's because shared preferences isn't really designed for that kind of data storage. It is really designed for just one-off variables that are stored and updated rarely. So what's the way then of storing data in your app which is relatively complex, which needs to be updated regularly, and maybe which needs to be searched, queried in a certain way? Well, to do that in Android, we use something called SQLite. So SQL is a server query language, and it's a very standard language for interacting with databases. If you've done any work on the web, you may well have worked with MySQL, which is a slightly different version. And if you've never seen SQL before, you might want to do a quick Google for Introduction to SQL, something like that, just to get a little bit of background. But of course, I'll talk you through everything you need, and we'll do it in a new project. So we'll call this database demo, and all the usual settings. We're going to be working completely in the console here anyway. So all we're going to do in this video is create a database and then create a table in that database in which we'll store some data, and then we'll pull some data out from that table. So it's all the basic stuff that you might want to do with a database essentially. And as we go through the process, it will become hopefully a lot clearer how these databases work and what indeed they are. All right. So first off, we're going to surround everything we do with a try and catch, with the general exception E, because there's lots of things that could potentially go wrong here. Stage one then is to create our database. So we do this by creating a variable of a type SQLite database, and I'll call it my database. And then we open it from our current context, so this, and then we can do this in a number of different ways. I normally go for open or create database. So this is handy because it will open the database if it already exists, and if it doesn't, then it will create it. So it does both jobs for us in one command. And I'm going to create a database of users. So this is the name of my database. I'll call it users. A couple of other settings we need. Again, we've got a mode just like we had with shared preferences. And I usually go for mode private. That means that it will only be accessible to your app. If you want to share your data with other apps, then you might want to have a different mode, but the vast majority of the time, you're probably going to want mode_private. And then we can have a special error catching method there, but I don't normally bother with that. I'll just put null. Okay, now you have a database. Congratulations. The next step is to put a table in your database. So if you imagine your database a bit like being an Excel file with lots of different tabs along the bottom, then a table is like one of those tabs. So it contains a certain type of information. So my database, and we're going to execute some SQL. So now most of our code from now on is going to be SQL code, which is a completely different language to Java, but it's one that's fairly easy to get the hang of. So what we'll do is we'll create a table, and we'll do that if it doesn't exist. So the grammar there isn't great, but you get the idea. So we'll only create the table if it doesn't exist. So a bit like this open or create database, we'll only create the database if it doesn't exist, otherwise we'll open it. And here we'll only create this table if it doesn't exist. And the table name is going to be users. So the table name doesn't have to be the same as the database name, and generally they won't be the same, but in this case it's probably going to be a database with just one table, so it's both about the same sort of thing. And then we have to specify the types of data that we're going to store in our database. So I'm going to store the name and the age of my users. So the first variable we're going to store is name, and this is going to have a type of varchar, which is basically a string. It's a string of characters, char variables all put together. So basically this is another way of saying string. And then we're going to have age, which is going to be an int. And we then have to specify the number of digits in our int. I'm assuming there's going to be no one in my database older than 999. So I think int 3 is quite safe. And then we're just closing that bracket there. So we're creating a table. If it doesn't exist, the table is called users and it has two variables in it, name and age. Name is varchar, which is basically a string, and age is an integer with 3 digits. Notice the capitalization there. Generally in SQL, we capitalize everything except for the specific names of tables, databases, and variables. And that just makes it a little bit more readable, believe it or not. But notice also that Android Studio is not parsing our SQL here, so you have to be a lot more careful than usual. If we've got an error in our SQL, then Android Studio is not going to tell us, and we won't find out until the app itself is actually run and this command just fails. Okay, so now hopefully we've got our table. So let's execute another SQL command. And this one is going to insert some data into that table. So basically we're creating a user. So we're going to insert into users, and the variables that we're going to create for this user are name and age, and the values we're going to give to them are Rob and 34. Just. There we go. So notice that Rob has got the single quote around it to show that it's a string. We don't need that with the integer. So very quick challenge then. Can you create your own SQL statement which inserts your own data into your database? Go for it. All right, I'm sure you managed that. I'm just going to insert one more item. So insert into users, name, age, and then values, and we'll have Tommy. I'm sure he won't mind me telling you his age. There we go. So we've got 2 people in the database now, each with a name and an age. Now it's time to get that data out of the database. So to do that, we use what's called a cursor object. And we normally use C to represent the cursor. And the cursor essentially allows us to loop through all of the results of a particular query and do something with them. So it'll make more sense when we've got a query going. So my database dot, and then we want a raw query. And again, we're going to use some SQL to run our query. And I'm just going to select everything from the database. So I use select star for everything from users. And then if we want, we can have a signal here or a method which will cancel the query while it's in progress. That's only really necessary if you're likely to have really big queries, which we definitely don't here, so we can just put null. Okay. Then we need to get the column indexes for name and age. And this is the main part that's different to if you've worked with SQL on a web system, for example, with MySQL. You don't need to deal with column indexes, but we do here. So what we'll do is create an name index, which is going to be the cursor c.get column index, and that's going to be the column index for the name column. And this just allows us to access those columns later on. Similarly, we're going to use age index, and that's c.get column index and age. All right, we're almost there. Next, we take our cursor and we move to the first result, which presumably is going to be me. Then we keep going, we keep looping through the results as long as C is not null. So if for example we didn't have these two lines in there and we run this code, then C would be null right from the start because there's nothing in the user's table. But we're expecting this to happen twice, once for Rob and once for Tommy. So then we just want to get the content of that. So for now, we'll log the name, and we use C for cursor dot get string. And notice again, we need to specify the correct data type. And we're going to get the string from the name index. Okay, very quick challenge then. Can you get the age and print it to the logs? Go for it. I'm sure you managed that. So we're just going to log age and then c.get int and then age index. That is of course an integer, so we need to convert it to a string using integer.toString and then brackets around our code. And then finally, we tell C to move on to the next result. And then that will loop round and round until it's all done, and then it will stop. And that's it. So in just under, 10 minutes or so there, we've done pretty well. We've created our database. We've created a table within that database, inserted 2 users into it, selected all the users from it, and then got the indexes of the various columns in the table, and then we've looped through all of the results and printed them to the logs. I shouldn't say that too confidently until we've actually done it, but I think we should be okay. So we'll run that on the emulator. But we don't really need to actually see the emulator screen. All we're interested in is the logs. Let's change to info. Got a lot of code there. Let's just search for name first of all. And there we go. You've got Saranga, which was from a test I did earlier, and then Rob and Tommy. Fantastic. And then age. There we go. 34 and 4. Okay. So you probably know what's coming. I want you to, preferably without looking at this, although you probably need to look back once or twice, especially if you haven't worked with SQL before. I want you to create a database called events, which will have the name of a historical event of some sort along with the year that it happened. And then insert 2 historical events and get the details of them and print them to the logs. Simple as that. Go for it. Okay, here goes then. So, much the same as before, just a little bit quicker. We'll create our try and catch with an exception E. And then we'll print a stack trace if something bad happens. Then we'll create our SQLite database. I'll call it events this time, just to change things up a little bit. And we'll create it from the app context.open or create database. And we'll call it events. Private mode again, and we won't have our error handler or anything there. Then we'll execute some SQL, which will create a table if it doesn't exist, and that table will be events. Now, once again, don't be fooled into thinking that database names and table names are all the same. You might well have a big database and then lots of little tables within it. But when things are very simple, often the database name and the table name are very similar. And we're going to have the event, which is a varchar, and the year, which is an int. This time we're going to need 4 digits for obvious reasons. All right. Now let's execute some more SQL. And we're going to insert into events, event and year with the values. I'm going to have end of World War II and 1945, mostly because it's one of the few historical dates that I actually know. And then another one. So insert into events, and then event and year, values, Wham split up is what we're going to have this time. If you don't know who Wham are, you must go and look them up. And it happened very sadly in 1986. And you can decide for yourself whether you think I had to look that date up. Alright, so now we've got our data in there. We now need to get it out. So we're going to create our cursor, C. It's going to be a raw query. And again, we're just going to select everything from the events table. And we're not going to need to cancel that query while it's happening, so we can just put null there. Then we'll create our column indexes. So we've got event index, which is going to be c.getColumnIndex event, and same for year index, c.getColumnIndex year. Then we'll move to the first result in the results set, and we'll keep going as long as C is not null, which will hopefully be twice. And then we'll log. This time I'm going to put results event so that I can do a nice easy search for them. And then c.getString event index, and of course results year, c.getInt year index. and we're going to convert that to a string in the usual way. There we go. All right, fingers crossed. That should give us exactly the results that we want. So let's search for results this time. Nothing there yet. Whoops, looks like I do have an error. Did you spot it? Create table if not exists. And actually, while we're there, I can see another one. We need to close those brackets there. So this is how easy it is to make mistakes with SQL, because you get so used to the automatic error handling. Or, right, yeah, here's another small mistake. Don't forget to move C to the next result. Otherwise, your results will go on forever. And there we go. You can see I've got definitely more than 2 results there. That's because I ran it several times to fix my errors. But that's fine. It is all at least working now. Okay, so that's how you create a database, create a table in it if it doesn't exist, insert some data into it, and then get the data out. So there's infinitely more that you can do with databases, and we're going to go into quite a bit more detail in the next video, particularly with queries, which are really powerful ways of extracting data from databases. I'll see you there.